They found him there, a German shepherd, rigid and unyielding, sitting in the half-shadow of a small bedroom where the air still carried the scent of burnt wood and smoke. His paws were raw, streaked with dry blood and ash, but he would not move. Not when they called, not when they tried to coax him. His eyes, dark, heavy and unblinking, were fixed on the crib. Inside it, a baby stirred. Their soft whimper, a restless arm stretching into the silence, and still the shepherd did not turn away. It was not aggression, it was not fear. It was something older, something heavier, a kind of oath. The room itself seemed to hold its breath. The curtains had long since been scorched by flame, replaced now by the thin blue of early morning light. Dust drifted through the air in slow, weightless movements, catching against the shepherd's fur, which was stiff with soot. His ears twitched, faintly at every sound the child made, and then stilled again as if he was listening to a language no one else could hear. I remember standing in that doorway, unable to step closer. It felt like walking in on something sacred, something I wasn't meant to disturb, because this wasn't just a dog watching a child. This was a sentinel at a threshold, a guardian, at the edge of something fragile. His chest rose and fell, shallow, deliberate. The baby's breath fogged the rim of the crib, small and uneven. Two rhythms, side by side, each waiting on the other, and in that stillness I felt the weight of something unspoken. The shepherd was not going to leave, not until the child was safe. I had seen animals cling before to burned-out houses, to doorsteps where their owners never returned, to cages they thought might open again. But this was different. This dog wasn't clinging. He was choosing to anchor himself to a single crib, to a single fragile heartbeat, choosing with every ounce of his battered body to keep watch. His gaze never wavered when the baby shifted. His paws dug slightly into the floorboards, though they trembled with exhaustion. His tail lay still, heavy and unmoving, as though all the energy left in him had been condensed into those eyes, eyes that said, "If you take the child, take me too." I don't know how long I stood there before I realized my own breathing had slowed to match theirs. The world outside, sirens fading, footsteps echoing down hallways, voices calling orders faded into a blur. Inside that room, there was only the sound of two fragile breaths, and somehow it felt like everything in me had been waiting for that sight. Because when I looked at the shepherd, I didn't just see an animal. I saw loyalty so sharp it hurt to look at. I saw a story I didn't yet understand, written into scars, into soot, into silence. I saw the unrelenting weight of love. The baby shifted again, a small fist uncurling, reaching outward into the space beyond the crib's wooden bars, and in that moment, the shepherd moved for the first time. Not away, not forward, just closer. He lowered his head until his nose brushed against the edge of the crib, as if to remind the child he was still there, as if to say that no shadow, no flame, no silence would take him away. And I swear I saw the baby's fingers pause in the air, then curl softly, clumsily, into the shepherd's fur. A grip that meant nothing, a grip that meant everything. The room stayed silent. My chest tightened with something I couldn't name. I should have spoken. I should have moved. But all I could do was watch and breathe, and feel the certainty settling over me like dust in that burned-out air. This was not the beginning of their bond. This was the echo of something already made. And in that quiet, with the shepherd's body trembling but unyielding, and the child's hand tangled in his fur, I knew nothing I had lived through before could prepare me for what I was seeing. This was loyalty made flesh. This was love refusing to die. This story will break you, and then rebuild you, like share and tell us where in the world you are watching from today. The first time I noticed the scars, it was only because the light shifted. A pale shaft of morning broke through the blackened curtain rods and caught against the shepherd's coat, revealing what had been hidden in shadow. Thin, jagged lines cutting through the fur along his flank, old wounds layered over fresh burns. They weren't the kind of marks a street fight would leave. No, these were the kind of wounds born of heat, falling debris, and a desperate attempt to shield something smaller than himself. But he didn't flinch. Not when he shifted, not when the air moved across his raw skin. His body remained rooted, locked into that posture beside the crib, as if even the memory of pain bowed to the deeper instinct that tethered him there. The baby had quieted now, one tiny hand still resting against the coarse strands of his fur, the rise and fall of his chest steadying in sleep. And yet I could not step away. Something in me resisted the pull of the outside world, where reports waited to be filed, where questions demanded answers. Instead, I stayed, because I needed to understand how he got here. The smell lingered. Smoke, charred wood, the bitter edge of melted plastic. It clung to the shepherd's coat, seeping deep into his skin, a living memory of whatever fire had swallowed this place before we arrived. When I bent closer quietly, careful not to disturb him, I saw it then, a faint black streak across his muzzle, as though he had pushed through ash to reach the crib. That image struck me harder than any report could. Not a firefighter, not a rescuer. A dog, fighting through smoke to stand guard over a child no one else could reach in time. I tried to imagine the night before, but the pictures came fractured, like shards of glass glinting in the dark. The crackle of flames gnawing through walls, a baby's cry muffled beneath smoke, the pounding of paws against scorched floors, and then silence, until only he remained. I should have turned away then. I should have gone back to the others, carrying news of what I had seen. But something kept me rooted, my weight pressed into the doorframe, my throat thick with words I couldn't form. Because when I looked at him, I saw more than just survival. I saw grief. Not the wild, frantic grief of an animal torn from its pack, but a quieter kind. The kind that carved hollows in the chest and lingered like smoke in the lungs. The shepherd's eyes had that weight, that knowing. And though I didn't yet understand it, some part of me knew he hadn't just chosen the crib because it was there. He had chosen it because everything he had left was inside it. I shifted slightly, testing the air, and for the first time his gaze flickered. It wasn't fear. It wasn't anger. It was warning, gentle, restrained, but absolute. He wasn't guarding the crib from me. He was guarding the bond. And in that moment I felt the strangest ache ripple through me. Because I recognized it, that desperate, fragile grip on what little remained. I had once known it myself. The baby stirred, the smallest sound spilling into the room like a drop of water on stone. The shepherd responded instantly, ears twitching, body leaning forward just enough for his muzzle to rest again against the wooden frame. It was like watching a compass needle pull toward the true north. The world could collapse around him. The air could fill with fire again. But as long as that crib held breath, he would not move. I closed my eyes and tried to imagine how long he had sat like this. Hours, a whole night? Long enough for the pads of his paws to split, long enough for his body to begin trembling under its own exhaustion. Dogs don't measure time the way we do. They measure loyalty. And by that measure, he had lived lifetimes in this room. My mind wandered then, unbidden, to the fragments of rumor I'd heard outside before stepping in. A neighbor's voice, hushed but heavy, saying something about the family who once lived here. Words like too late, like nothing left to save, like only the child was found. I hadn't wanted to listen then. But standing there watching the shepherd refuse to blink, refuse to breathe too loudly, I understood what those words meant. This was not just loyalty. This was a loss refusing to let go. I remembered suddenly a moment years earlier, not in a burned house, not in a room heavy with smoke, but in a sterile hospital corridor, where my own hands had been empty, where my own lungs had struggled to draw air after being told the word was gone. That same silence had followed me then. That same feeling of the world, narrowing to a single point, something you couldn't leave behind, even if the rest of life demanded it. And in some impossible way, standing in that room with the shepherd, I felt less alone, because he knew it too. The baby exhaled softly, a sigh so small it could have been mistaken for the settling of the house. The shepherd's ears perked, and for the first time I saw his body shift, just slightly, so that his flank brushed against the side of the crib. A subtle movement, almost imperceptible, but enough that I knew it had been deliberate. A reminder, I am here. Do not fear. And then, just as quickly, stillness again. The longer I stood there, the more the questions pressed at me. Who had he belonged to? Who had carried him across thresholds, fastened collars around his neck, whispered his name into fur before sleep? Who had left him these scars, not out of cruelty, but out of circumstance, of fate, of tragedy? The answers were not in the room, only their echoes, the charred edges of picture frames on the dresser, the faint outline of family portraits blurred by smoke. The half-melted remains of a toy truck lying by the wall, all remnants of a life that had burned too quickly, and the shepherd. The shepherd was the last thread still holding it together. I could not tear my eyes away. The weight of his silence pulled me deeper, and before I knew it, I was kneeling in the doorway, lowering myself closer to his level, though still outside his reach. He didn't move. He didn't bare his teeth. He only watched me with those steady, endless eyes, the kind that carried whole stories without a sound. And I realized then, whatever had brought him here, it wasn't finished. There was more to uncover, more to learn, but it would not come in explanations or in words. It would come in moments like this, in the patience to sit, to wait, to breathe. Alongside him, until the story revealed itself piece by fragile piece, the baby stirred again, the faintest cry rising and then fading into a sigh. The shepherd's muscles tensed, his head angling toward the sound as though the rest of the world had disappeared. And in that instant, I understood something with absolute clarity. The crib wasn't just a place he guarded, it was the last boundary between loss and survival, between what he had already lost and what he refused to lose. I let my hand rest gently against the doorframe, wood rough beneath my fingers, and whispered not to him, not to the baby, but maybe to myself. "You're not alone." The words dissolved into the air, swallowed by silence, but something in his gaze shifted. Not softened, not broken, but acknowledged. As if he had heard. As if, for the first time, the story had begun to open. The baby's breathing steadied again. The shepherd's body sagged just slightly, weariness pulling at his frame, but his eyes remained fixed on the crib. And as I rose slowly to my feet, I knew this was only the beginning. The scars, the smoke, the silence. They were only the surface. Beneath them lay the weight of a story still waiting to be told. And I was not leaving until I found it. I don't know what it was that made me step further into the room that morning. Maybe it was the way the baby's breath fogged against the cool air, so delicate and fleeting that I feared it might vanish altogether. Or maybe it was the shepherd's trembling legs, standing rigid despite their exhaustion, a body that should have collapsed hours ago but still refused to yield. Whatever it was, I moved, one step inside, then another. Each creak of the floorboard sounded too loud, like I was breaking into a memory that wasn't mine. The shepherd's gaze snapped toward me, not hostile, never hostile, but weighted, commanding. His body tensed, pressing closer to the crib. His message was clear: do not take one step too far. So I stopped. Not out of fear, but out of respect. Because I understood something then. The line between us wasn't about territory. It wasn't about dominance, it was about grief. And grief has borders that cannot be crossed without permission. The room held traces of the family that once lived there, though most of it had been claimed by smoke and flame. I let my eyes drift slowly, carefully, piecing together fragments the fire hadn't stolen. On the dresser, a silver frame stood blackened but intact, glass cracked down the center. Beneath the damage, I could just make out the outlines of faces. Of two adults, a child older than the one in the crib, and beside them, faint but unmistakable, the proud silhouette of the German shepherd himself. His fur then was brighter, unmarked, his posture tall and certain. I swallowed hard. That frame was more than just an object. It was proof. Proof that he had not stumbled here by accident. Proof that this was his home once too. And suddenly, the scars across his body told a different story. Not a stray caught in the wrong place, not a wanderer who chose a crib out of chance. No, he had fought his way back into a house already claimed by fire, not to save himself, but to anchor himself to what remained. My throat tightened as I turned. Away from the dresser, the faint outlines of toys lay scattered near the wall, plastic warped, a doll's head half melted, a ball blackened by soot. The fire hadn't spared much, but its cruelty was selective. The crib, though smoke-stained, had somehow endured. The thin blanket draped across the baby's chest bore only the faintest grey smudges, as though the shepherd himself had shielded it from worse. The pieces began to assemble in my mind, though no one had told me the story outright. I could see the fire breaking out in the night. The family scatters in panic. The shepherd darted toward the sound of the baby's cries. His body cutting through smoke, pushing through collapsing beams, taking the burn so the child wouldn't. And when the flames had died down, when silence had taken the place of screams, he had not left. He would not leave. The baby stirred, again, and the shepherd leaned forward, lowering his muzzle against the wooden frame until a soft sound, almost a whine, escaped his throat. The sound was raw, torn from a place deeper than instinct. It wasn't just a call to soothe the child, it was grief made audible. I felt my chest ache in answer, a memory clawing its way back into me years ago, a hospital monitor flatlining, my voice whispering words into a silence that could not answer back. The shepherd's whine was the same note, the same fracture in the air. And I thought then, maybe that's why I couldn't step away, because his silence mirrored my own. The house groaned in the wind outside, loose boards scraping against each other. The shepherd's ears twitched, his head lifting, scanning the room as if expecting the fire to roar back to life. His muscles bunched as though he might hurl himself once again between the crib and the unseen. But nothing came, only quiet, only the low rattle of ash settling into corners. He didn't relax, though, not fully. His eyes swept the room, then returned to the crib with that same unbreakable focus. And I realized he was living in two worlds at once, half in the present, guarding what still breathed, half in the past, replaying the moment when everything else was lost. I shifted closer to the wall, careful to keep distance between us. My eyes caught on something near the floor, a collar, charred, twisted, the metal buckle warped by heat. I bent slowly, lifting it into my hand. The leather was cracked, brittle, but the nameplate still clung to its surface. The letters were scorched, but legible enough. Ranger. I let the name settle, in my mouth silently. Ranger. The sound fit him, though saying it aloud felt dangerous, like breaking the fragile stillness that hung between us. So I only held it in my mind, watching the shepherd ranger as he stood vigil by the crib. If he noticed the collar in my hands, he gave no sign. His eyes remained fixed on the baby, though I wondered if some part of him felt its absence, if he recognized the weight of what I now carried. The baby's breathing deepened, the kind of sleep only innocence allows. Ranger's body sagged just slightly, as though the rhythm of that tiny chest was the only thing keeping him upright. His paws, raw and cracked, trembled on the floorboards. Every instinct in me wanted to reach out to offer water, food, comfort, something to break his suffering. But I knew better. This moment wasn't about me. This was a covenant between child and dog forged in fire and ash, and I was only a witness. Still, questions pressed harder now. Where were the others, the adults in that photograph, the older child? Were they gone, taken by the fire, or taken somewhere else, separated by tragedy? And if they were gone, then what would become of Ranger now? Would he let anyone take the baby from him? Would he collapse when he realized the world outside? This room demanded movement, demanded surrender, demanded choices he hadn't been asked to make. I pushed those questions aside. They were too heavy, too sharp for this fragile silence. Right now there was only this moment. A baby breathing, a dog keeping watch, a name whispered in the ruins. I let my back press against the wall, sliding, slowly until I was seated on the floor. My knees bent, my palms resting on the charred collar in my lap. The wood was cold beneath me, but I stayed. And as the light shifted through the broken window, I felt the weight of a story still unfolding, the kind that doesn't announce itself in words or explanations, but in quiet gestures, in scars, in the unyielding stare of a shepherd who had already given everything and still refused to move. The baby exhaled again, a soft sigh slipping into the air. Ranger's eyes closed for just a heartbeat, the first time I'd seen him allow himself, that release. And in that fragile second I understood. This was not a story of survival alone. This was a story of love refusing to die. And though I did not yet know how it would end, I knew I could not look away. The morning light shifted slowly across the room, carrying with it a faint warmth that did little to touch the chill of the burned walls. Ranger remained beside the crib, unmoving, as though he had become part of the shadows themselves. Yet something had begun to change. The baby, tiny fingers brushing against the edge of the blanket, moved closer to Ranger's side. It was a motion so slight, so delicate, that I almost missed it. But Ranger noticed. His ears twitched ever so slightly, and his body, though tense, seemed to lean toward the touch, acknowledging it without drawing attention to himself. It was the first act of communication between them. Not a word, not a command, but something older and deeper. Recognition. I watched quietly, seated against the wall, as if any sudden movement might shatter this fragile exchange. The baby's hand hovered over Ranger's fur, uncertain at first, then brushing downward in a soft, exploratory gesture. Ranger's nose lowered, sniffing the tiny fingers with a precision born of instinct. His tail, heavy and rigid moments before, twitched once barely perceptible like a heartbeat in the still room. And then he exhaled softly, the sound low and reverent, a hum of acceptance. The baby's eyes widened just slightly, a quiet understanding, dawning as if sensing the same covenant I had glimpsed hours earlier. No words were needed, no gestures beyond this gentle, almost sacred touch. For hours, the three of us existed in silence. The outside world, with its sirens and voices and demands, seemed to dissolve into the walls. Only the baby's soft breathing and Ranger's steady watch remained. I tried to eat, tried to move, but every instinct pulled me back to that space, between crib and dog. There was something in the way Ranger shifted his weight, adjusting his body so the baby could touch him more easily. Each movement was deliberate, careful, almost ritualistic. It wasn't obedience, it wasn't training, it was understanding, and it was sacred. The baby's fingers traced across Ranger's fur again, slower this time, exploring scars and soot, the raw edges of fur and skin. I winced at the sight, the reminder of the fire's violence, but Ranger didn't. His eyes remained locked on the crib, but his body had softened, as if acknowledging that the child's presence could not harm him. I realized then that this was the first time I had seen him truly begin to heal. Not physically, his paws still cracked, his body still stiff, but emotionally. The simple act of being accepted, being touched without fear, had begun to lift the weight from his shoulders. I couldn't help but remember the old photographs I'd seen of the ones blackened by fire, but still faintly visible. The family, smiling, Ranger proud. And now in this burned-out room a new chapter was being written. The child, silent and tentative, had begun to forge a bond stronger than any fire could destroy. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but the change in Ranger was real. His eyes, though still heavy with memory, carried a glimmer of trust. His movements were less rigid. His breath, though shallow, carried a steady rhythm. And the baby, as if sensing the transformation, reached farther, wrapping tiny fingers in the coarse strands of fur near his shoulder. Ranger exhaled again, a low guttural sound this time, a hum of recognition and reassurance. Time blurred. Hours passed, though it felt like minutes. The world outside the room ceased to exist. There were no orders, no neighbors, no emergency responders. Only the quiet rhythm of breathing, the soft brush of fingers against fur, the gentle rise and fall of chests aligned across species. Ranger began to shift closer to the crib, adjusting, so that the baby's hand could rest more comfortably against him. It was a careful, deliberate motion, like a teacher guiding a student, a protector ensuring safety without force. And in that movement, I saw the first true sign of acceptance. Not from the dog alone, but from both of them. The child had reached out, and Ranger had responded not out of instinct, but out of something deeper, something older. I moved slightly, just enough to shift my weight, and Ranger's ears flicked toward me. His gaze met mine for a fleeting moment. No aggression, no fear, only a quiet acknowledgement. Then his eyes returned to the baby, unwavering, as if to say, This is mine to protect. This is sacred. The weight of that moment pressed against my chest. I realized I had never seen anything like it before, never witnessed the beginning of a bond so fragile, so fierce, and so irrevocable. It was not love at first sight. It was recognition. It was trust formed in silence, solidified through gestures too small for words to capture. The baby's breath grew shallow again, fatigue settling into the body of one who had endured trauma unknown to them. Ranger's head lowered slightly, his nose brushing the baby's arm as if to guide sleep, to guard against any shadow or threat that might linger unseen. I watched, utterly still, as the room became a sanctuary of quiet protection. Every scar, every tremble, every small exhalation of breath seemed to carry the weight of survival and the beginning of healing. It was a slow, deliberate intimacy, a bond forged not through commands or toys, but through presence and patience. Hours melted into one another. Ranger remained vigilant, his body a living shield around the crib, yet the rigidity had softened. He shifted occasionally, allowing the baby's hand to rest more freely against him, leaning slightly to absorb the gentle pressure. There was a rhythm forming between them, breath, heartbeat, touch that transcended anything I had ever seen between human and animal. And in that rhythm, I understood the depth of what had begun here. I finally allowed myself to exhale, the first deep breath in what felt like a lifetime. Ranger did not flinch at the sound. The baby stirred slightly in response, but did not wake. The tiny fingers still clung to the coarse strands of fur, trusting, exploring, grounding themselves against the weight of a protector. And in that stillness, I felt the first real shift in the room. The tension that had filled the space since the fire, the weight of loss, of trauma, of unspoken grief, began to lift, replaced by something quieter, gentler. Hope, tentative but present, settled into the edges of the room. I dared to look closer, noticing the small details I hadn't before. The way Ranger's tail lay flat against the floor now, relaxed but ready. The faint shimmer in his eyes as if reflecting the baby's innocence, the soft exhalation that carried reassurance with every breath. And the baby, unaware of the magnitude of what was occurring, continued to explore, to touch, to trust. It was not a grand gesture. There was no triumphant moment, no loud acknowledgement. Only the small perfect acts that form the foundation of love and loyalty. A brush of fingers, a soft exhale, a shift of weight. I sank lower to the floor, letting my hands rest on my knees, watching silently as Ranger's body settled against the crib. The bond had begun. It would grow, it would deepen. But for now it existed in this fragile, perfect balance of trust and protection. And I knew, in a way that I could not yet articulate, that this moment, this simple, quiet communion, was the beginning of something that would not easily break. Because in that room, with a burned house behind us and the world outside still chaotic, a child and a dog had found each other, and in finding each other, they had begun to heal. The morning stretched longer than I could measure, the light shifting through the scorched windows, falling across the room in thin, pale streams. Ranger remained beside the crib, a steadfast sentinel, but something had changed. His posture, once so rigid and tense, now carried a subtle softness, a careful easing of muscles that spoke of a bond forming beyond instinct. The baby, small hands, still exploring the coarse fur, had begun to recognize the rhythm of Ranger's presence. A movement, a shift in weight, even the slightest change in breath, became part of an unspoken conversation. It was hypnotic to watch. I had been sitting against the wall for hours, knees drawn close, observing what I could not yet name. Every subtle twitch of Ranger's ears, every blink and exhale became a punctuation in the silent dialogue between child and dog. I found myself holding my own breath, afraid that any sound might break the fragile understanding forming before me. The baby's tiny fingers traced along Ranger's scarred flank, moving slowly, deliberately. Ranger lowered his head, allowing the contact, his eyes closing for a fleeting second as if acknowledging the child's innocence. His tail, though heavy, flicked slightly, a small private signal of comfort and trust. And then, the baby's lips brushed against the edge of the blanket, curling it gently toward Ranger. I realized, with a quiet ache in my chest, that this small gesture was the child's first act of care, a gift returned to the one who had been guarding them from the shadows of fire and loss. Time became fluid in that space. Minutes blended into hours, though the world outside continued its relentless rhythm. Every so often a faint sound from the hallway would drift through the scorched walls, voices, footsteps, a distant siren, and Ranger would shift slightly, muscles coiled, eyes scanning but never leaving the crib. It was protective vigilance, honed by trauma, but tempered now with the gentleness of a guardian who had found reason to soften. The baby sensed it too. Each time Ranger moved, the small hand would follow, gripping the fur gently, pressing in, rhythm with the dog's own shifting weight. It was an intuitive, silent assurance. "I am here, you are safe." I had begun to notice the details, the faint tremor in Ranger's paws, the way he adjusted his body to cradle the child's hand, the soft exhale that seemed to say, "I am still here, and I will remain." Every movement was deliberate, careful, a choreography of protection and trust. At one point, the baby wriggled slightly in the crib, attempting to turn toward the window. Ranger responded immediately, nudging his body against the edge of the crib, guiding the child's small torso back to a safer position. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but I saw it, and it shattered something inside me. The child, so small and unknowing, had already begun to rely on Ranger not in fear, but in a quiet understanding of his presence. And Ranger, battered and scarred though he was, accepted the responsibility without hesitation, without complaint. I thought of the fire again, of the way smoke had choked the air, how the house had groaned and cracked, and I understood that Ranger had endured more than any dog should have to bear. Yet here he was, unbroken in spirit, offering safety without demand. The baby's fingers found a patch of fur near Ranger's neck, tracing the jagged lines of scar tissue that ran through his coat. He flinched slightly, but not in pain. It was as if the touch brought him into the present, grounded him in a reality where the past's shadows could not reach. I reached out, hesitant, touching Ranger's shoulder lightly. He stiffened for a heartbeat, then relaxed again, leaning slightly into my hand before returning his focus to the child. The boundaries were clear. The child first, then the dog, and I an observer, a witness to a bond I could neither command nor claim. Hours passed, though it felt like a day compressed into a single heartbeat. The baby's small murmurs and sighs became the rhythm Ranger attuned himself to, each subtle noise met with a shift, a movement, a soft exhale. I began to understand the language forming between them, a language older than words, older than human commands. It was the language of protection, of trust earned through presence, of loyalty unspoken yet absolute. At one point, the baby rolled, slightly, and Ranger's head followed the movement, resting his chin gently against the edge of the crib. He allowed the child to brush against him, to press closer, as if offering warmth and safety. And in that quiet act, I saw something I had not seen before, the beginnings of healing. Ranger was no longer just a survivor of fire and loss. He was a participant in this child's life, a presence that mattered beyond instinct, beyond survival. I caught myself smiling softly, though the gesture felt almost irreverent in the face of the trauma that lingered in the room. The baby's small fingers tugged gently at a patch of fur near Ranger's shoulder, and Ranger leaned in, permitting the contact. The trust, tentative at first, was solidifying, becoming something unspoken yet undeniable. I thought of the hours, perhaps days, that Ranger had spent in silence before I arrived. Each moment of waiting, each second of vigilance, each exhale and subtle movement had prepared him for this bond. And now, with the child's presence anchoring him, I could see the first flickers of hope returning to a body and spirit long weighed down by grief. The air in the room grew warmer as the day progressed, though the walls remained scarred and blackened. Dust drifted lazily in the sunlight, catching against Ranger's fur in a way that made the scars and soot glimmer faintly. He did not notice, or if he did not care. His focus remained unwavering, his attention wholly directed at the crib and its occupant. The baby's small sighs and stretches became a rhythm that Ranger mirrored, adjusting his weight, lowering, his head leaning in closer as the child moved. It was almost ceremonial, a dance of quiet understanding, and I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes, not from sorrow, but from the quiet beauty of what was unfolding. Hours blurred further into the afternoon. Ranger had shifted slightly, pressing closer, allowing the baby's tiny hands to explore freely. Every subtle gesture, every quiet movement, reinforced the trust that had been growing for hours, and then a moment of stillness. The baby's small hand rested atop Ranger's head, brushing gently over his fur, and Ranger lowered his eyes, exhaling softly. There was no urgency, no command, only acceptance, only presence, only the quiet promise that he would remain, unyielding, beside this fragile life. I leaned back, against the wall, exhausted but unwilling to leave. I understood now that this bond was fragile, delicate and sacred. I could not interfere, could not impose myself upon it. All I could do was witness, and perhaps in that witnessing bear some small part of its weight. The fire, the loss, the scars, all of it had led to this moment. A child, small and fragile, had reached out. And Ranger, battered and broken yet unbowed, had answered. I whispered quietly, more to myself than to anyone else, "You're both safe here." And for the first time since I had arrived, Ranger's tail flicked in a subtle, almost imperceptible gesture of acknowledgement. The baby's fingers tightened, slightly around the fur, and in that room, in the quiet aftermath of fire and loss, a new chapter began, a chapter of trust, of silent protection, of healing that would unfold slowly, deliberately, and without words. The day had shifted into late afternoon, the sunlight fading into muted streaks that fell across the scorched floorboards. Dust motes swirled lazily in the thin beams, catching against Ranger's fur, highlighting the scars and soot that traced his body like a map of survival. He remained beside the crib, unmoving except for the subtlest adjustments in posture, small shifts that allowed the baby to rest more comfortably and absorbed the child's delicate movements without protest. I sat in silence, pressed against the far wall, my hands folded loosely in my lap. Every movement, every sound in the room seemed magnified. The faint creak of the floorboards beneath Ranger's paws, the soft rise and fall of his chest, the tiny, almost imperceptible size of the baby, all became a rhythm I could not look away from. I noticed then, with a clarity that startled me, how much Ranger had changed. Not physically, his scars remained, his paws still raw but in presence. Where once he had been rigid, tense, a sentinel bound by trauma and vigilance, now there was a softness, a measured patience. He moved with purpose, guided by instinct but tempered by an emerging tenderness. The baby reached out again, fingers brushing the coarse fur near Ranger's shoulder. He leaned slightly toward the crib, allowing the touch, closing his eyes for a heartbeat as if memorizing the sensation. It was the kind of quiet surrender that comes from trust earned over time, a recognition that the world is less frightening when someone or something will not abandon you. And I realized, with a weight I could barely articulate, that Ranger had begun to transform. Not in grand gestures, not in obvious ways, but in the subtleties, the tilt of his head, the exhale that followed the baby's sighs, the way he shifted his body to accommodate the child's movements. He was no longer merely surviving. He was learning to live again, to connect, to extend loyalty in a new, deliberate form. The baby cooed softly, pressing a hand against Ranger's paw. Ranger lifted his gaze, meeting the small, trusting eyes of the child. For a moment, the room seemed suspended in a fragile equilibrium, two lives touching without words, two souls recognizing the contours of shared vulnerability. I leaned forward slightly, careful not to intrude, and watched as Ranger's tail twitched subtly. It was a motion so small, almost imperceptible, but in that quiet room it carried meaning, acceptance, reassurance, a silent promise that he would not falter, that he would remain steadfast in this new role he had assumed. The baby's hand moved, exploring the lines of his face, brushing against ears, nose, and muzzle. Ranger allowed it, leaning in gently, guiding the touch, making room for connection without expectation. His body, though weary, seemed to gain strength from the presence of the child. It was extraordinary to witness, this delicate dance of trust forming in silence. I remembered the first time I had entered the room, the rigid, unyielding posture of a dog hardened by fire and loss. And now here he was, shifting closer, curling his body around the crib, his head resting lightly against the wooden frame. It was a protective embrace, but one softened by recognition, by the understanding that the child's presence had changed the nature of his watchfulness. I felt a lump in my throat, realizing that this transformation was not a choice made lightly. Ranger had endured trauma no one could fully comprehend, and yet he had begun to trust again, not me, not the walls of the room, not the outside world, but the fragile life he had vowed to protect. Time passed slowly, deliberately. The world outside, the sirens, the voices, the chaos of recovery seemed to fade entirely. There was only the quiet hum of two lives coexisting, learning the rhythm of each other. Ranger shifted his head slightly, watching over the baby's tiny chest as it rose and fell. Every slight exhalation, every stir of fingers, drew a response from him, a nudge, a repositioning, a soft exhale in acknowledgement. And in that room, I began to understand the depth of what had been lost and what could yet be saved. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows that stretched across the burned floorboards. Dust motes glimmered in the waning light, and Ranger remained steadfast, eyes flicking occasionally to the door, to the window, alert to any disturbance. But unlike before, there was no panic, no tension twisting his muscles into rigid lines. His vigilance had softened into deliberate observation, guided not by fear, but by loyalty and care. The baby stirred again, a tiny whimper escaping into the still room. Ranger responded immediately, nudging the child gently with his nose, repositioning, so the tiny hand remained cradled against his fur. The motion was subtle, fluid, precise, a guardian instinct refined into a language of empathy and protection. I could feel my own heartbeat slow as I watched them. This was not a bond forged in convenience or affection alone. This was a covenant of survival and trust, formed through trauma, sustained by patience and solidified by recognition. Ranger's transformation was not complete, but it was undeniable. The dog who had once sat rigid, trembling, scarred and wary was now a silent protector, attuned to every nuance of the child's presence. I allowed my eyes to wander over his scars, soot and all, and felt a pang of reverence. He had carried more than his own survival through fire and loss. He had carried the weight of responsibility, a responsibility he had embraced without question. The room remained quiet, save for the gentle breathing of the baby and the subtle shift of Ranger's body. He leaned slightly against the crib, a silent acknowledgement of the child's presence and fragility. The faintest flick of his tail followed each small movement, each stretch of tiny fingers, each sigh. I realized then that Ranger's watchfulness had become something more than vigilance. It had become a dialogue, a conversation without words, a commitment made manifest in subtle gestures and unwavering attention. And I, a silent witness, felt the enormity of it press against my chest. Night approached, the light fading entirely, leaving the room bathed in soft shadows. Ranger remained at the crib, unbowed by exhaustion, unshaken by the passage of hours. His eyes flicked occasionally toward the doorway, alert to any movement, but always returning to the child. His body, though scarred and weary, seemed to draw strength from the small presence that had come to anchor him. The baby's tiny hand rested on Ranger's fur, the fingers curling gently, a touch that had become both reassurance and bond. Ranger lowered his head, exhaling softly, leaning into the contact, and I knew without a doubt that the transformation I had witnessed was more than physical. Ranger's heart, worn and tested by fire and grief, had begun to heal. I settled back against the wall, watching as the room embraced the quiet night. Ranger's body remained close to the crib, his breath steady, his eyes alert yet softened by the presence of the child. I felt the first real sense of peace since entering the room, not the absence of pain or trauma, but the emergence of trust, loyalty, and protection that promised continuity, safety, and healing. This was not a sudden change. It had taken hours, patience, and delicate interactions, but the bond was forming, silently, deliberately, unbreakable in its quiet strength, and I realized with a deep, quiet reverence that I had never witnessed anything so sacred in my life. The baby's breathing deepened into a calm rhythm, and Ranger exhaled, lowering his head fully onto the crib's edge. His eyes closed briefly, a momentary release, though he remained alert, a shadow of vigilance ever present. And in that quiet room, in the aftermath of fire and loss, the first true signs of recovery had begun. Ranger was no longer just a survivor. He was a guardian, a companion, a protector shaped by the past but anchored firmly in the present. The silent transformation had begun, and it would continue, quietly, steadily, and irrevocably, through the bond forming between dog and child. Night had fully settled over the house, folding the charred walls into soft, forgiving darkness. A muted stillness lingered, broken only by the faint rise and fall of the baby's chest and the subtle shifting of Ranger's body beside the crib. He remained a silent guardian, alert yet calm, a presence that seemed to draw strength from the quiet trust forming between him and the child. I stayed against the far wall, knees pulled close, hands clasped loosely around my own forearms, afraid to disturb the delicate rhythm that had taken hours to establish. Ranger's head moved slightly, tracking my every shift, and I realized he had begun to observe me with the same caution he had once reserved for unseen dangers. There was a new dimension to his vigilance now. Ranger's protective instinct had extended beyond the crib. He had begun to include me in the radius of his watchfulness, not as a threat, not as an adversary, but as a participant in the fragile ecosystem of trust he had built. His eyes would flick to my face, lingering just long enough to gauge my intentions, then return to the baby with unbroken focus. I understood the unspoken message. You may stay, you may witness, but do not falter. I will protect what is mine. The weight of that understanding pressed against my chest, a mixture of awe and quiet guilt. Here was a creature who had endured loss beyond measure, yet he included me cautiously in his loyalty. It was both a gift and a responsibility I felt, wholly unprepared to bear. The baby stirred, shifting slightly within the crib. Ranger responded instantly, his body adjusting to shield the child, a subtle motion almost imperceptible but instinctively precise. His nose brushed the infant's arm, nudging gently, guiding the movement as if to say, "Do not wander. You are safe here." I found myself holding my breath, captivated by the interplay between the two. There were no commands, no audible instructions, only the language of presence, of touch, of subtle cues born of instinct and deep care. Ranger's transformation, I realized, had become fully apparent in these quiet interactions. No longer merely a dog surviving trauma, he had begun to act with purpose, with empathy, with deliberate attention to the fragile lives that now depended on him. I reached forward cautiously, laying a hand lightly on the edge of the crib. Ranger's ears twitched immediately, head lifting, eyes flicking to mine with that familiar mix of alertness and evaluation. But he did not move away. He did not growl. Instead, he shifted slightly, his body forming a gentle barrier between the baby and me while signaling his silent approval of my presence. It was a small gesture but monumental. Ranger had not yet accepted me fully, but he had recognized me as an ally, someone permitted into the circle of trust he had forged with the child. The baby's hand reached toward my face, brushing my sleeve, as if seeking reassurance in the human who had been present for hours. Ranger's gaze softened momentarily at the sight, though the vigilance in his posture remained. I could feel the weight of his scrutiny, but beneath it was an unmistakable thread of acceptance. I allowed myself a slow, careful exhale. It was the first I had taken in hours that felt entirely my own. Ranger's watchfulness had begun to extend not just toward the child, but toward the fragile circle of safety that included me. Time stretched, fluid and slow. The baby dozed, nestled against the edge of the crib, fingers resting lightly on Ranger's fur. Ranger shifted his weight slightly, allowing the touch, his head lowering with deliberate care. Every movement was measured, careful, precise, a choreography of protection and trust that had developed without words, without instruction, without precedent. I watched, transfixed. The soft exhalation from Ranger, the tiny murmur of the baby, the gentle flick of the dog's tail, all were punctuation marks in a conversation conducted entirely through presence and gesture. And I realized something. Ranger had begun to teach me without knowing it. Patience, vigilance, quiet devotion, the art of watching without interfering, of protecting without dominating. Hours passed in this way. Shadows lengthened, stretched across the room like soft blankets. Dust motes shimmered in the faint glow of the remaining light, drifting through the air. Ranger remained steadfast, leaning subtly against the crib, head resting lightly, eyes flicking toward any potential disturbance beyond the room. At one point, I noticed the faintest twitch in his tail, a slow, deliberate motion that coincided with the baby's gentle stretch. It was a language, refined and silent, a communication built over hours of observation and interaction. Ranger had begun to incorporate me into that language, acknowledging my presence without allowing it to disrupt the bond between him and the child. I thought of the fire again, of the way the flames had consumed everything around him. Scars marked his body. Soot clung stubbornly to his fur, and his paws bore the weight of hours spent standing vigilant. And yet, in this quiet room, I saw the emergence of something that transcended survival. Ranger had begun to live again, not merely to endure, but to inhabit his role as protector with purpose and awareness. The trauma of the past had shaped him. Yes, but it had not defined the entirety of his existence. The baby stirred again, small sighs spilling into the quiet room. Ranger responded instinctively, nudging the child slightly with his nose, repositioning so the tiny hand rested comfortably against his fur. He lowered his head fully, exhaling softly, allowing the infant to lean into him. I watched, noticing the subtle rise and fall of his chest, the delicate relaxation of muscles that had been tense only moments before. He was teaching the child, without instruction, the meaning of safety. And in turn, the child was teaching Ranger through touch and presence the meaning of trust. I reached forward again, this time allowing a finger to brush lightly against Ranger's shoulder. He stiffened for a heartbeat, eyes flicking to mine, and then relaxed, leaning slightly into the touch. It was a fleeting acknowledgement, a subtle gesture of acceptance. He was still wary of my intentions, still protective of the fragile trust he had built, but he had begun to permit me into the circle. It was not a victory, it was not a complete understanding, but it was progress. Night deepened, drawing the room into darkness, softened only by the faint glow of moonlight filtering through broken windows. Ranger remained beside the crib, vigilant, yet calm, breathing synchronized with the baby's, head lowered, body curled protectively. I felt a quiet reverence settle over me. Here was a dog, scarred and tested by fire and trauma, who had endured more than most could bear. And yet, through instinct, patience, and the small presence of a child, he had begun to transform. No longer merely a survivor, Ranger had become a silent guardian, a teacher, a protector in every sense of the word, and in extending cautious trust toward me. He had begun to weave a circle of safety that included not just the child, but the human who had been present to witness it all. I leaned back against the wall, exhausted yet unwilling to move. The room hummed with quiet life, the small breathing of the baby, the subtle shifts of Ranger's body, the gentle pulse of presence that had emerged over hours of observation. It was not dramatic. There were no grand gestures, no words spoken aloud, only the steady rhythm of trust, the silent promise of protection, and the first faint threads of healing woven between dog, child, and human. And in that moment, I understood the depth of what had begun here, a bond that would not break, a loyalty that would endure, and a quiet transformation that would continue slowly, deliberately, and irrevocably, as long as the baby needed it, and as long as Ranger remained vigilant. The morning had begun quietly, sunlight spilling faintly through the smoke-stained windows, illuminating the dust that danced in the air. Ranger remained close to the crib, body taut, yet softened by the presence of the child. For hours, nothing disturbed the fragile rhythm we had built. But as the day progressed, I began to notice a subtle shift in tension beneath the surface, an unease that had not been there before. I had stepped to the doorway to fetch water when the sound first reached me. A low murmur from outside, voices, speaking in hurried, clipped tones. It was faint at first, almost swallowed by the walls and remnants of fire. Ranger's ears flicked instantly, head lifting, muscles tightening in a way that betrayed alertness. I froze, sensing the change immediately. Ranger's body moved before my mind fully registered the danger. His stance shifted, rigid but deliberate, eyes scanning the doorway, and then the small window panes. The infant stirred, sensing the change in the dog's posture, fingers curled around the blanket, tiny lips pressing in a silent, instinctual grasp for comfort. Ranger leaned in closer, his body curling protectively around the crib, head lowered, breathing shallow but steady. The room had become a sanctuary, yes, but now it felt fragile, as though the walls themselves could no longer shield us from the outside world. Ranger's muscles coiled with purpose, a guardian ready to face whatever intrusion might breach the delicate trust we had built. I listened closely, straining to catch the voices outside. They were approaching, deliberate and hurried, carrying an urgency that made the hair rise on the back of my neck. Ranger's tail flicked once, a subtle signal of his awareness and the shift in the air. He moved slightly, nudging the crib so that the baby remained shielded from view, the small body now entirely beneath the weight of his presence. I felt a pang of fear, a deep, instinctive dread that had nothing to do with my own safety. The baby was entirely defenseless, and Ranger had become the single, unwavering line of protection. He was aware of it too. His eyes never left the doorway, his stance unyielding, a silent sentinel prepared to confront whatever threat lurked just beyond the frame. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I dared not move, dared not speak, not even breathe too loudly. Ranger's gaze followed every shadow, every movement, calculating, measuring, waiting. I realized then that his loyalty was absolute, not just to the child, but to the sanctity of the room, the fragile equilibrium that had taken hours to establish. Outside, footsteps grew heavier. A door creaked open. The voices approached the hall, now clearer. A combination of concern and authority, speaking quickly, not noticing the delicate balance inside the burned house. Ranger responded immediately, a low growl escaping from deep in his chest, a warning, a demand, a statement of intent. The growl was subtle but undeniable, reverberating through the room. The baby stirred slightly, a soft whimper escaping into the still air. Ranger's head lowered, exhaling slowly but firmly, his body pressing closer, shielding, guarding, asserting the boundaries of what was protected. I pressed myself further into the wall, heart pounding, as Ranger's attention sharpened. He moved along the edge of the crib, scanning the room for escape routes, for threats, for any sign that the fragile bubble of safety might be breached. The growl deepened, vibrating through the air, a warning not to intrude upon what had been quietly claimed. I realized then that Ranger's transformation, his loyalty, his trust, his slow return to life was being tested for the first time. The child's presence had drawn him into a protective rhythm, but this was the first real external challenge. And Ranger, scarred, weary, and broken by fire and trauma, did not hesitate. The voices drew closer still. One spoke sharply, perhaps out of frustration, perhaps out of ignorance, unaware of the fragile ecosystem within. Ranger's muscles coiled further, his stance becoming almost statue-like in its intensity. I could see the tension in his shoulders, the flick of his ears, the subtle rise and fall of his body as he prepared for action if necessary. I felt the baby stir again, tiny fingers clutching at the blanket. Ranger's head lowered fully, nose nudging the child gently, guiding, reassuring, commanding without words. It was an instinctual choreography of protection, honed by trauma, yet refined by the bond forming in silence over the past hours. I could feel the panic rising in my own chest, yet I knew better than to act. Ranger's loyalty had been earned over the slow passage of hours. Interference now could disrupt the delicate balance. All I could do was witness, to remain silent, and trust in the dog who had already endured so much. The first person stepped into the doorway, a figure silhouetted against the dim hallway light. Ranger's growl intensified, low and throaty, vibrating through the room. His body shifted slightly, pressing the crib even closer, head raised in a posture that was both warning and promise. He was saying, clearly, "This is mine. This is sacred. You may not touch it." The figure froze, unaware of the fragile hierarchy in place. Ranger's eyes met theirs for a heartbeat, unwavering, unflinching. There was no aggression beyond the warning, no intent to harm unless the boundary was crossed. Yet the sheer presence of authority, human, adult, unfamiliar, created a tension that filled the room like smoke. I remained pressed against the wall, barely breathing, as Ranger's growl softened, still vigilant but measured. The figure hesitated, confusion flickering in posture, perhaps noticing the baby, perhaps sensing the unspoken barrier. Ranger's ears flicked to me, then back to the crib, then to the figure, creating a delicate triangle of watchfulness. The baby's eyes fluttered open briefly, small and vulnerable, gazing at the dog whose body shielded them completely. Ranger exhaled, a soft, reassuring hum now mingling with the lingering growl. It was both a warning and a comfort, a duality I had never seen so clearly expressed. Minutes passed, though each felt like an hour. The external presence remained, shifting slightly, speaking in low tones, attempting to coax, to reason, to bridge the distance between human intention and animal instinct. Ranger did not relent. He moved slightly, nudging the baby again, lowering his body like a shield, eyes unblinking, muscles coiled, every movement precise and deliberate. I felt an unfamiliar surge of admiration and sorrow. The dog who had survived fire and loss had endured so much, and yet here he was, standing unwavering, willing to face any intrusion for the sake of the fragile life beside him. The figure finally retreated, muttering under their breath, unaware of the silent battle that had occurred in that small, burned-out room. Ranger's body slowly relaxed, though his eyes remained vigilant, scanning for any further threats. The baby stirred again, and Ranger lowered his head, exhaling softly, the tension easing only gradually. I pressed a hand against the edge of the crib, careful, reverent, feeling the warmth radiate from the dog's body. His eyes flicked to mine, acknowledging my presence and silent gratitude for remaining still, for not breaking the fragile trust that had taken hours to forge. Night settled fully, and the house exhaled with quiet relief. Ranger remained beside the crib, a steadfast sentinel, his body relaxed yet alert, breathing synchronized with the child. The room was still, except for the gentle rise and fall of chests, the faint hum of trust renewed after a trial, and the unspoken understanding that some threats could not be faced with words alone. The transformation I had witnessed in Ranger, the slow emergence of loyalty, protection, and trust, had now been tested. And though the tension had passed, the bond between dog and child had only deepened, more unbreakable for having faced its first real challenge. The night had deepened into a quiet darkness that pressed against the walls, wrapping the room in shadows. Ranger remained close to the crib, his body taut and vigilant despite hours of stillness. The events of the day, the voices in the hallway, the figure at the doorway had left a residue in the room, a tension that neither the baby nor I could ignore. I sat against the far wall, knees drawn close, hands resting lightly on my lap. Every creak, every whisper of movement drew my attention. Ranger's ears flicked constantly, subtle yet sharp, his body shifting slightly to cover every angle of vulnerability. I could feel the rhythm of his breathing syncing with the child's, a quiet duet of protection and trust. The first true test of the bond came not from intrusion, but from uncertainty. Outside, the fire department had returned briefly, checking the structure, their voices carrying the sterile authority of routine inspection. I had not expected Ranger's reaction to be so immediate, so instinctive. He rose slightly, body tense, tail stiff, eyes narrowing as the sound approached. The baby stirred at the noise, small whimpers escaping as fingers tightened around the edge of the blanket. Ranger exhaled softly, low and deliberate, pressing closer to the crib, forming a living shield. Every muscle in his body conveyed both readiness and reassurance. He was saying, "Do not fear, I am here. Nothing will reach you." I noticed the subtleties in his posture, the slight lift of his head toward the doorway, the tension in his shoulders, the precise alignment of his body along the crib's edge. Ranger was no longer reacting blindly. He had learned, adapted, and understood that threats came in forms both loud and quiet. I reached forward, hand trembling slightly, brushing a fingertip against his shoulder. He stiffened at first, but then relaxed subtly, leaning into the touch just enough to signal acknowledgement without compromising his vigilance. He was teaching me again. Presence without interference, protection without panic. The voices drew, closer, some carrying concern, others impatience. Ranger's growl remained low, controlled but unmistakable. His eyes, dark and unwavering, followed the shadows creeping across the hallway. The baby murmured, fingers brushing over his fur instinctively, a silent plea for security. Ranger responded by lowering his head, exhaling with the soft, steady rhythm that had become a language in itself. It struck me then how fragile yet resilient the trust had become. One false movement, one loud word, one abrupt motion could undo the delicate equilibrium we had built over days. Yet Ranger maintained it, a silent arbiter of safety, refusing to relinquish the child to the uncertainties of the world outside. Minutes stretched interminably. I watched the dog, witnessing the tension etched into every line of his body. There was no aggression in his eyes, only calculation and loyalty. He had endured fire, loss, abandonment, but here, faced with a new kind of uncertainty, he adapted with patience and precision. The baby shifted slightly, tiny sighs escaping as fingers traced the coarse fur. Ranger adjusted seamlessly, leaning closer, tilting his body so the child's hand could rest against him safely. It was a dance of trust, performed in silence, and I realized it was fragile, beautiful, and unbreakable only if handled with care. A figure appeared at the doorway again this time, one I recognized from earlier, someone whose presence carried authority but also confusion. Ranger's ears twitched, growling and deepening. The figure paused, sensing the tension in the room, perhaps understanding that the child and dog shared something more than proximity. They shared an unspoken covenant. I could see Ranger's awareness sharpen, the muscles in his legs and shoulders coiling subtly, a readiness born of instinct yet honed by trust. The baby stirred, sensing the shift, tiny fingers gripping his fur. Ranger nudged the child gently, exhaling softly, and in that moment, I understood the depth of his commitment. He would not falter. He would not allow harm to come near. The four. Adult outside hesitated, words softening, steps cautious. Ranger's eyes flicked toward me for the briefest moment, acknowledging my presence, my stillness, my respect for the unspoken rules he had established. Then he returned his gaze to the doorway, unwavering, unblinking, a sentinel who would not yield. I pressed my hand against the edge of the crib again, a silent reassurance for both dog and child. Ranger exhaled slowly, the low rumble of his chest vibrating beneath the baby's small hand. He was teaching the child and me simultaneously. This is how trust endures. This is how protection manifests. The tension stretched further. The authority figure outside whispered, attempting coaxing, perhaps reasoning. Ranger responded with a subtle shift, nudging the crib slightly to block sightlines, head lowering to shield the baby. Every motion was precise, deliberate, a study in restraint and control. I realized then that Ranger's loyalty had matured, beyond mere instinct. He was no longer reacting out of fear or training. He was choosing protection, choosing trust, choosing the child's safety over every other consideration. The depth of his transformation was visible in every muscle, every twitch of his ears, every exhale. Hours seemed to compress into minutes. The tension in the hallway ebbed slowly, the authority figure retreating with muted frustration, unaware of the silent battle that had transpired. Ranger's body relaxed just slightly, though his eyes never left the crib. He lowered his head fully, exhaling softly, allowing the child to settle against him. I felt a profound respect for the dog, for the loyalty and instinct that had guided him through fire, trauma, and now this subtle confrontation. The baby's fingers rested lightly against his fur, a touch of reassurance, of recognition, of bond. Ranger exhaled, low and measured, a sound that spoke of both victory and vigilance. The night deepened further, darkness settling into the corners of the room. Ranger remained beside the crib, vigilant yet softened by the child's presence. I pressed myself against the wall, feeling the weight of hours and the quiet realization that the bond we had formed was no longer fragile. It had been tested. It had endured, and in surviving the first real external threat it had grown stronger, deeper, and more unbreakable. I watched as Ranger shifted slightly, nudging the child gently with his nose, repositioning to form a more encompassing shield. His eyes flicked to me once again, a glance that conveyed both trust and understanding. The silent covenant was complete. Dog, child, and observer, bound together in the delicate balance of loyalty, protection, and healing. The baby stirred, cooing softly, pressing a tiny hand against Ranger's head. Ranger exhaled, eyes closing briefly, body curling protectively, embracing the small presence entrusted to him. I felt a quiet exhalation escape my lips, the tension of hours dissolving into reverent calm. Outside, the world continued in its chaos. Inside, the burned room held a fragile sanctuary, built not of walls, but of trust, vigilance, and the unspoken bond between dog and child. Ranger's loyalty had been tested, and he had passed without falter. And in that quiet moment, I understood fully. The journey was far from over, but the bond we had forged was resilient, unyielding, and capable of withstanding even the pressures of the uncertain world outside. Dawn crept over the horizon, soft and hesitant, spilling muted light across the charred floorboards. Dust hung in the air like a gentle haze, the remnants of yesterday's chaos settling into quiet stillness. Ranger remained curled beside the crib, body taut yet softened by the presence of the sleeping child. Every exhale, every subtle shift, spoke of vigilance tempered by trust. He was no longer merely surviving, he was guarding, he was teaching, he was choosing. I watched from the corner of the room, pressed against the wall, heart heavy with the weight of what lay ahead. Outside, the world waited impatiently, carrying with it questions, authority, and the potential to disrupt everything that had begun to heal within these burned walls. And now, for the first time, I had to make a decision that would define not just my life, but the lives of the child and the dog who had become our silent guardian. The knock on the fee. Joy was tentative at first, then firmer, sharper, a reminder that the outside world did not move at the measured pace of this room. Ranger lifted his head instantly, ears pricked, body coiling in anticipation. The baby stirred at the sound, small fingers clutching at the blanket, seeking comfort in the fur beside them. Ranger nudged the child gently, exhaling softly, and I realized with a tightening in my chest that the moment for action had arrived. I rose slowly, careful not to startle either of them, and moved toward the door. Ranger's gaze followed me, unwavering, unblinking, muscles taut. I knew he understood what was required. He had already made his choice. The child's safety above all else. My choice, however, remained uncertain. Outside, the voices were clearer, now carrying the weight of concern, authority, and impatience. Social services, fire inspectors, people who had no understanding of the fragile ecosystem we had cultivated in this burned-out room. Their intentions were not malicious, yet their intrusion threatened to dismantle the trust that had taken days to forge. I took a deep breath, feeling the tension in Ranger's shoulders, the subtle twitch of his tail, the gentle rise and fall of his chest in synchronized rhythm with the child's. And in that quiet, suspended moment, I realized that the decision I faced was not about compliance with rules or expectation. It was about protection, loyalty, and moral courage. I opened the door slightly, enough to see the concerned faces of the adults in the hallway. Ranger rose immediately, moving in front of the crib, body low but imposing, eyes locked on the intruders. A low growl rumbled through the room, steady and controlled, a warning, a boundary, a statement that the fragile trust within these walls was not to be violated lightly. The adults froze, confusion flickering in their posture, unsure how to proceed. Ranger's gaze did not waver. He did not bark, he did not lunge. He merely stood sentinel, a living testament to the bond he had forged with the child, a guardian whose loyalty transcended fear and past trauma. I stepped further into the hallway, voice low, deliberate. "You can't take him," I said softly, barely above a whisper. "Not yet. Not without understanding what he's endured, what we've endured." The adults exchanged glances, hesitant, uncertain, sensing the gravity of the moment, but bound by protocol. Ranger shifted slightly, moving closer to the crib, body curling protectively around the child, head lowering in a gesture of containment and reassurance. His presence was commanding, yet quite a paradox of power and gentleness that left the intruders momentarily paralyzed. I felt the weight of the choice pressing down on me. To comply would be simple, safe, conventional. To resist and advocate for the fragile bond we had cultivated was dangerous, uncertain, and morally complex. And yet, as I watched Ranger's unwavering stance, felt the soft rise and fall of the child's chest against his fur, I knew that my decision could not be guided by fear. It had to be guided by loyalty, by recognition of the silent covenant, forged in this room. It had to be guided by love and understanding the same forces that had transformed Ranger from a survivor into a guardian. I stepped fully into the hallway, eyes meeting the faces of the social workers. "He's more than just a dog," I said softly. "He saved this child. He protected him when no one else could. I can't hand him over without understanding, without respect for what he's done." A tense silence followed, broken only by the faint creak of Ranger's paws as he shifted beside the crib, still alert, still unyielding. The child stirred slightly, fingers brushing the dog's fur, anchoring him in this moment of moral reckoning. Ranger exhaled, low and steady, a subtle confirmation that our decision and our collective stance was understood. Minutes passed, though. They felt like hours. The adults outside finally softened, some gesturing, others retreating slightly, unsure how to challenge the quiet authority of a dog whose loyalty and vigilance were absolute. The Ranger did not relax, did not blink. He simply stood as he had throughout the trials of the past days, a sentinel, a protector, a guardian of fragile trust. I felt a wave of relief wash over me, tempered by the knowledge that this was only the beginning of a more permanent decision, a choice to protect, to fight for, and to honor the bond that had formed within these burned walls. Ranger's loyalty had been tested and he had passed. My own courage would now be tested in kind. Returning to the room, I knelt beside the crib, hand resting lightly on Ranger's shoulder. He leaned into the touch, eyes flicking to mine with a subtle acknowledgement as if to say, "We endure together, we protect each other." The baby's small hand rested atop Ranger's head, fingers curling gently in instinctual recognition. The key. Dog exhaled, soft and low, the sound vibrating beneath the child's hand, a tactile reassurance that the world was, for now, right where it should be. The day stretched on, filled with quiet observation, measured breath, and the deliberate ritual of protection and trust. Ranger remained curled around the crib, body relaxed yet ready, eyes flicking occasionally toward the door, then returning to the child with unwavering devotion. I felt a deep sense of reverence settle over me. This was more than survival, more than loyalty, more than instinct. It was redemption, the culmination of pain endured, trust rebuilt, and a bond forged in silence, tested through trial, and affirmed through quiet courage. As the sun began to dip toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the room, Ranger shifted slightly, lowering his head to rest near the child's tiny hand. His eyes closed briefly, a subtle exhale escaping as though the tension of the day had been partially released. Yet his vigilance remained, a quiet reminder that protection is an ongoing duty, a covenant that does not end with mere moments of relief. I pressed my hand against his side, feeling the rise and fall of his chest, the warmth beneath my palm, and whispered softly, more to myself than to him, "You've earned this. We've earned this, and I won't let it go." The baby yawned, stretching, tiny limbs against the warmth of Ranger's body. He exhaled softly, nestling closer to the dog who had become both shield and comfort. Ranger responded by adjusting his posture, pressing his body slightly more protectively around the child, exhaling once again a quiet affirmation that the bond had survived the first true external test. And in that moment, I understood the depth of what had been achieved. Not just survival, not just loyalty, but a redemption born of quiet courage, enduring vigilance, and the profound, unspoken understanding that some bonds are too sacred to break. Night fell fully, soft and forgiving. Ranger remained beside the crib, body curled protectively, breathing synchronized with the child. I leaned back against the wall, exhausted, yet filled with a sense of awe at the courage and loyalty I had witnessed. The choice had been made, redemption had begun, and within the burned walls of this fragile sanctuary, trust had been tested, honor had been affirmed, and the quiet miracle of survival and protection had been realized. The night hung heavy outside the burned walls, but inside the room, the air was different, saturated not with smoke and loss, but with a fragile, nascent peace. Ranger remained curled around the crib, his body a living shield for the child whose small breaths rose and fell in rhythm with his own. Each exhale seemed to carry away the remnants of tension, leaving behind a quiet strength that had been forged through fire, trauma, and the tests of the day. I pressed myself closer to the wall, feeling the rough texture of scorched wood beneath my hands. I could sense the subtle relaxation in Ranger's muscles, the way he had shifted to accommodate the child more comfortably, yet without letting down his guard entirely. This was not victory in the conventional sense. It was a quiet triumph, a slow affirmation of trust, loyalty, and shared survival. Earlier, the figure outside had retreated, and with them, the immediate threat had dissipated. But Ranger's vigilance had not wavered completely. His eyes scanned every shadow, every corner, as though the memory of intrusion lingered in the folds of the room. The child stirred gently, tiny fingers brushing over his fur. Ranger exhaled slowly, nudging the baby with his nose, repositioning slightly so that the small body remained enveloped in warmth and safety. It struck me then how delicate yet profound this bond had become. The dog, who had once been merely a survivor of fire and abandonment, had transformed into a guardian of not just life, but of emotional sanctuary. And the child, in turn, had become a source of healing, coaxing trust from a creature long accustomed to isolation and pain. I reached out, letting a hand rest lightly on Ranger's side. He tensed initially, then relaxed, leaning subtly into the touch. I could feel the strength coiling beneath his fur, the quiet power of muscles trained by instinct and reinforced by loyalty. Ranger was not simply a protector, he was an embodiment of resilience, a living testament to the possibilities of redemption when patience, trust, and courage converge. The child's eyes opened briefly, soft and hazy in the dim light. They fixed on Ranger's face with an unspoken recognition, tiny fingers grazing the fur. Ranger lowered his head fully, exhaling softly, letting the contact linger. The room held a breathless quiet, as though acknowledging that some connections were beyond explanation, beyond verbal articulation, purely elemental, purely sacred. I thought of the days before this, of the fire, the loss, the nights spent wandering in uncertainty. Each step, each trial, had led us here to this room, to this fragile peace, and I realized that the redemption I had sought for myself, for the child, for Ranger, was no longer abstract. It was tangible, it was here. It existed in the synchronized rise and fall of breaths, in the soft hum of fur against skin, in the quiet vigilance that had become second nature to the dog who had endured so much. The evening wore on, the fading light of day casting long, muted shadows across the charred floor. Ranger remained attentive, yet the tension that had dominated earlier hours had eased. The intrusions, the voices, the subtle threats, they had tested our bond, yet they had also solidified it. Ranger's loyalty, unwavering through fire and fear, had been proven, and my role as guardian, observer, and participant in this fragile ecosystem had been affirmed. I felt a deep sense of responsibility settle over me. The choices made today, the courage to stand firm, had secured not just physical safety, but the emotional scaffolding necessary for healing. Ranger's transformation, from a dog marked by trauma to a sentinel of trust, was complete in its quiet way. And I understood finally that redemption is not a spectacle. It is the accumulation of small, deliberate acts of courage, patience, and understanding. The baby yawned, stretching tiny limbs against Ranger's protective body. The dog responded, instinctively, nudging the child gently, adjusting posture to provide comfort while maintaining his protective stance. I watched, marveling at the precision of his movements, the subtlety of his care. There was no need for words. Every gesture, every shift, every exhale conveyed volumes. Ranger was teaching the child safety, patience, and trust. And through this silent pedagogy, he was also teaching me. I shifted slightly, easing closer to the crib, careful not to disturb the delicate equilibrium. Ranger's head lifted briefly, eyes flicking toward me, then returning to the child with a calm vigilance. It was a look of acknowledgement, of quiet partnership. He understood that I too had chosen to protect, to observe, to respect the covenant forged within these burned walls. And in that understanding, a profound sense of connection settled over us, binding dog, child, and human in a shared commitment to survival, safety, and emotional integrity. Outside, the night deepened, the world continuing its rhythm unaware of the silent miracles occurring within the burned structure. Ranger exhaled, a low, deliberate sound that vibrated beneath the child's hand. The infant murmured, pressing against the fur, finding both warmth and reassurance in the presence of the guardian, who had become inseparable from his own existence. I pressed my hand lightly against Ranger's flank, feeling the subtle rise and fall of his muscles, the quiet energy coiled beneath the surface, ready yet relaxed. The dog had endured unimaginable trials, yet here he was, steadfast, patient, protective. And the child, unaware of the magnitude of what had transpired, had begun to repay that loyalty with trust, comfort, and the first gentle gestures of healing. I reflected on the journey to this point, the fires, the lost nights, the moments of fear and uncertainty. Every decision, every act of patience, every subtle acknowledgement had led to this fragile, sacred moment. Ranger's redemption, earned through steadfast loyalty and quiet courage, had become a shared victory. And in witnessing it, I felt my own redemption taking shape, not dramatic or declarative, but quietly real, anchored in presence, responsibility, and moral courage. The night continued in slow rhythm. Ranger remained curled around the crib, body forming a living barrier, eyes occasionally flicking toward the darkened doorway, ears attuned to every subtle sound. The child rested against him, fingers splayed. Gently over fur, small breaths synchronized with the steady exhalations of the guardian beside him. I sank fully to the floor, leaning against the wall, watching the interplay of trust, protection, and silent teaching. Here, in this burned-out room amid charred walls and fractured memories, a quiet miracle had unfolded. A bond forged through adversity, loyalty affirmed through trial, and redemption earned through the deliberate acts of courage and patience that define true guardianship. Hours passed, time folding upon itself in gentle rhythm. Ranger shifted, once nudging the child, exhaling softly, maintaining the protective embrace that had become second nature. The infant responded instinctively, pressing closer, a soft murmur escaping. I pressed a hand to my chest, feeling the resonance of trust, loyalty, and quiet triumph. The room held a deep, reverent stillness, punctuated only by the synchronized breathing of dog and child, the faint rustle of air through broken windows, and the soft exhalations that carried with them the affirmation of survival, protection, and the slow, deliberate emergence of emotional healing. And as I watched Ranger curled around the sleeping child, eyes half closed yet vigilant, I realized the depth of what had been achieved. This was not a dramatic victory, not a spectacle for the world to witness. It was the quiet assertion of loyalty, the reaffirmation of trust, the subtle yet profound redemption that arises when courage, patience, and steadfast love converge. Here in this burned room, with shadows playing softly across charred wood and dust drifting through gentle beams of moonlight, Ranger had found redemption. The child had found safety. And I, a witness and participant in this fragile ecosystem, had found a quiet, unshakable affirmation of what loyalty, trust, and courage truly mean. The night had softened into an almost tangible quiet, the burned walls of the room no longer carrying the sharp echoes of fear or tension. Only the gentle rise and fall of breathing remained, a subtle symphony of life, trust, and endurance. Ranger had curled fully around the crib, body warm, steady, and protective. The child slept peacefully, tiny fingers resting against his fur. Drawing comfort from the guardian who had become inseparable from his existence, I watched from my corner, kneeling on the floor, feeling the weight of the journey that had brought us here. Every trial, every moment of doubt, every instance of quiet courage had converged into this still, sacred moment. Ranger's eyes, half closed yet alert, flicked occasionally toward me. A silent acknowledgement of the bond we now shared. His loyalty, tested through fire, threat, and uncertainty, had been proven true. I reached out, resting a hand lightly on his shoulder. Ranger exhaled softly, nudging the child gently with his nose, encouraging a deeper, more restful sleep. The subtle movements spoke volumes. No words were necessary. Trust had become language, loyalty had become action, and protection had become a quiet rhythm that resonated in every corner of the room. The baby's small chest rose and fell in tandem with Ranger's steady breathing. I could see the faint flicker of eyelids as dreams found him, untroubled by the shadows of the day. Ranger remained vigilant, yet his tension had eased. The trials of survival and the intrusions of outside authority had not broken him. They had strengthened him, honed his instinct into something noble, quiet, and enduring. I allowed myself a slow exhale, the tension in my shoulders releasing fractionally as I watched the dog who had saved, guarded, and nurtured life without question. Ranger was no longer merely a survivor of his past traumas. He was a sentinel, a teacher, and a partner in healing. And through this bond, I found myself transformed as well, learning patience, humility, and the profound weight of quiet courage. Outside, the world continued, carrying with it its noise, its rules, and its uncertainties. Inside, however, time had folded into a sacred rhythm. Ranger exhaled, a soft rumble beneath the child's hand, a sound that seemed to carry reassurance, warning, and love simultaneously. I pressed a hand lightly to the crib, feeling the subtle vibrations of loyalty and devotion beneath my palm, the tangible evidence of trust earned through patience, vigilance, and quiet sacrifice. The room smelled faintly of smoke and dust, remnants of fire and struggle, but overlaid upon it was the warmth of fur, the softness of blankets, and the delicate scent of new life. Ranger shifted slightly, nudging the child closer to him, his body forming a living barrier against the unknown. The child responded instinctively, curling into the dog, tiny limbs relaxed, breathing deep and unconcerned. I realized then that the past and future existed only in the stillness of the present. Ranger's redemption was complete, not as a performance, not as a declaration to anyone outside, but in this room, in this quiet sanctuary, in the fragile life entrusted to his care. And the child in turn had become the reason for his continued vigilance, the anchor for his newly forged trust. I pressed myself fully against the wall, taking in the scene with reverent attention. Every detail mattered, the slight twitch of Ranger's ears, the gentle rise and fall of his chest, the soft murmurs escaping the sleeping infant. The room had become a living testament to resilience, courage, and the unspoken covenant between beings who had endured, who had survived, and who now in silence healed together. The world outside had no understanding of what had transpired here. The dog who had wandered through fire, the child who had known only fragility, and the human who had borne witness had created a microcosm of trust, love, and survival. And in this stillness, I felt the culmination of every trial, every struggle, every quiet act of courage that had brought us here. Ranger shifted slightly, adjusting the child in his protective embrace. His exhale was soft, rhythmic, and steady, filling the room with a subtle sense of calm. I could see the faint outline of muscles beneath the fur, the curve of his shoulders, the way his body formed a shield over the infant. It was a posture born of instinct, honed by experience, and solidified by love. I reached down, brushing a finger over his head. Ranger responded immediately, leaning gently into my touch, exhaling a low, warm rumble. There was no need for words. The language of loyalty, protection, and quiet courage required none. The baby, nestled safely in his presence, responded with a tiny, contented murmur, fingers curling against the fur. The night wore on, deepening in a rhythm that was at once eternal and fleeting. Ranger's vigilance never wavered entirely, yet the intensity had softened, giving way to a steady, watchful calm. The child slept on, untroubled by shadows or the faint noises from beyond the room, and I, kneeling quietly, witnessed the culmination of a journey defined not by drama or spectacle, but by the slow, deliberate acts of patience, courage, and loyalty that had shaped every moment leading to this point. I thought of the first time I had seen Ranger alone, wary, injured, and broken, and compared it to this moment. The transformation was staggering in its subtlety and profundity. From survivor to guardian, from fear to trust, from isolation to partnership, he had traversed every step with quiet dignity, guided by instinct and the bond that had been forged with time and care. I exhaled, allowing a soft, reverent smile to touch my lips. The child stirred slightly, tiny fingers brushing over Ranger's fur in an unspoken acknowledgement of safety, warmth, and trust. Ranger exhaled in response, nudging the infant gently, as if to say, "I am here, I will remain, you are safe." It was a moment of perfect equilibrium, fragile yet unbreakable, defined not by words or action, but by presence. The room had become a sanctuary, not of walls or doors, but of vigilance, trust, and the quiet bonds that endure when patience, courage, and loyalty converge. I rose slowly, careful not to disturb the fragile harmony. Ranger's eyes flicked toward me, then back to the child, never leaving the protective stance he had assumed. I stepped to the doorway, peering out at the night beyond, and allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement of the world outside, its challenges, its uncertainties, its demands. But in this room nothing intruded. No authority, no chaos, no threat could penetrate the sacred bond that had been forged. I returned to the crib, settling again against the wall, hand lightly resting on Ranger's side. His exhale carried reassurance, his body the warmth of steadfast protection, and the child slept on, completely enveloped in the calm of trust earned and loyalty proven. Time seemed suspended. The burned walls, the shadows, the faint smell of smoke and dust, all were softened by the presence of life, love, and enduring guardianship. Ranger exhaled, low and steady, the vibration beneath the child's hand a tactile testament to the trials endured and the quiet victories achieved. I whispered softly, a private acknowledgement, a benediction of sorts. "You've protected him. You've protected me. You've earned this, and I will honor it." Ranger's head shifted slightly, eyes flicking to mine, then returning to the sleeping child. The room exhaled as one, the fragile sanctuary secure. In this quiet, in this unbroken bond, in the slow rhythm of breath and heartbeat, redemption had been realized. Not in grand gestures, not in proclamations, but in the whispered loyalty of a dog, the instinctive trust of a child, and the reverent witness of a human who had learned the profound meaning of protection and love. The baby yawned softly, curling deeper into Ranger's fur. Ranger exhaled once more, gently nudging him into the most comfortable position, pressing the small body closer. I felt the warmth radiate, the subtle rhythm of life flowing uninterrupted, and for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to simply breathe. Outside, the world continued in its chaos, but inside, time had folded into an eternal, sacred moment. Ranger's loyalty had endured. The child was safe. And I, kneeling quietly in reverence, understood fully that some acts of courage, patience, and trust, though silent, are more profound than any spectacle could ever hope to be. The room, once filled with fear and uncertainty, now held only warmth, vigilance, and the quiet miracle of survival and trust. And in that room, with Ranger curled protectively around the sleeping child, the story of loss, redemption, and quiet courage found its final whispered closure.